November 8th, 1942, Sidi, Tunisia. The first light of dawn crept slowly over the jagged horizon, carving sharp silhouettes from the rocks scattered across the desert floor. Each shard of sandstone cast a long, cold shadow toward the German outpost built hastily along an ancient, half-crumbled Roman wall. The desert was always quiet at this hour, quiet in a way that felt unnatural to Obergrenadier Wilhelm Schmidt. The silence made him think of the stillness inside a bunker after the last shell had been fired, and everyone was simply waiting, listening for something that hadn't happened yet. He crouched low behind the stone barrier, helmet chinstrap pulled tight, his Mauser to the power of one Kar98k bolt-action rifle resting across his knees. The steel was cold enough to bite his palms. A warm breath of wind carried the smell of dust and diesel. It reminded him of the long convoy that had brought him here, weaving through endless ridges and arid plains, past shattered villages and burned-out hulks of Italian trucks. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He had seen Africa only in postcards before this, the dramatic sunsets, palms, whitewashed buildings. Reality was nothing like those pictures. Africa was stone and emptiness and sweat that never dried. Beside him, Gefreiter Heinrich Bauer wiped sand from his MG-34's receiver with quick, delicate motions. Bauer treated his machine gun like it was a living thing. Some men smoked before a battle. Bauer cleaned. "You hear anything?" Wilhelm murmured. Bauer shook his head once. "Just the wind." Wilhelm listened again anyway. The desert didn't have wind, it breathed. It hissed through cracks in stone walls, slithered over dunes, and went silent without warning. A poor substitute for the rustle of forest branches back home. He closed his eyes. For the briefest moment he pictured the valley near his father's farm in Hesse, the thick smell of pine, the bubbling creek, the distant clang of the village bell. That world felt further away each day. Then the radio crackled behind them. "Achtung! American troops sighted. They're advancing toward Hill 182. Wilhelm's eyes snapped open. The Americans? Here already? Until this morning they had fought mostly British units around the region. Rumours had circulated about an American landing in French North Africa, but rumours travelled faster than truth in war. Most of the Germans dismissed the idea. The Americans, they said, were untested, soft, inexperienced, a nation of factory workers and farmers, not soldiers. Wilhelm wasn't so sure. Anyone holding a rifle could be dangerous, anyone firing one even more so. He swallowed and crouched lower behind the wall. "Americans," Bauer muttered. He didn't sound impressed. "You think they're as weak as command says?" Wilhelm didn't answer. Immediately. Command said many things. "They're soldiers," he finally murmured. "Same as us." He didn't want to admit it aloud, but he felt a twinge of unease. A new enemy meant new unknowns. Unknowns got men killed. A silhouette emerged from the rear trench, Lieutenant Karl Weiss, crisp uniform, pressed even beneath the desert grime. His boots kicked up thin clouds of dust as he approached the forward line. "Positions," Weiss ordered, striding along the wall. "They're advancing in platoon strength. Expect probing fire before they push. We hold this line until the Panzer Group arrives." "Yes, Herr Leutnant," Wilhelm replied instantly. Weiss's jaw was set, determined. His pale blue eyes seemed almost too calm. "Schmidt. Bauer, your sector, covers the shallow ravine. Anything moving through it, you identify before you fire." "Jawohl." Wilhelm pressed his cheek against the warm sand, crawling forward until he could peek over the rocks into the ravine. The desert morning was turning gold, the sky pale and cloudless. A perfect day for flying, a terrible day for fighting. When every silhouette stood sharply against the sun, he swept the horizon. Nothing. No movement, no glint of metal, no shifting patterns of dust. But the radio had been right, someone was coming. Behind him, the MG-34's internal mechanism clacked sharply as Bauer slid a fresh belt into place. That sound, at least, was familiar. The MG-34 was the anchor of their defense. If American infantry tried to push forward across this open ground, it would cut through them like a chisel through soft stone. Wilhelm's mouth was dry. He shifted his rifle's bolt, ensuring smooth travel. The long, polished action felt solid in his hands. The Kar98k was dependable, precise German engineering distilled into 5 rounds of high-velocity certainty. 5 rounds. A thought flickered in his mind and left just as quickly. Will 5 be enough? He brushed it aside. It didn't matter. Moments later, Bauer hissed. Movement. Wilhelm froze. A low, rhythmic thumping drifted across the sand boots. Many boots, marching in coordinated steps. Then voices, faint but growing clearer. American accents, the sound of metal canteens clinking, the shuffle of gear. Then a crack, a rifle shot from a German post farther along the ridge. Birds exploded from a dead tree. Dust sprayed into the air. A tense quiet followed. Wilhelm raised his rifle, and then he saw them. American infantry climbed over a small rise with surprising coordination. Their uniforms were a slightly darker shade of green than British khaki, their helmets broader and rounder. But what caught Wilhelm's attention wasn't their uniforms, it was their rifles. Every man carried one. The rifles were long, dark, and unmistakably semi-automatic. He had seen diagrams of them before, heard rumours. The M1 Garand, 8 rounds in a clip, semi-automatic fire, faster than a bolt action, faster than his Kar98k could ever. Cycle, Bauer whispered. They're armed like officers. More than that, Wilhelm said quietly. Those rifles fire without working the bolt. Bauer blinked. They don't have to chamber every shot? Wilhelm shook his head. How many rounds? 8. Bauer cursed softly. A single American stepped forward first, probably a scouting element. His Garand dipped as he scanned the ravine, the barrel glinting in the growing sun. His movements were cautious but rehearsed, nothing like a fresh recruit stumbling through first contact nerves. Wilhelm steadied his breath. This would be the moment. Wait. Wait. Now. He exhaled and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked sharply through the desert. The American jerked backward, falling into a patch of brittle scrub. His helmet tumbled off and rolled noisily down the slope. Before the sound faded, 5 more Americans surged forward from behind the rise. Wilhelm worked his bolt fast forward, pull back, forward again. The second shot missed by a hair, kicking dust at the Americans' feet. Then the Americans opened fire. The Garands barked with rapid, rhythmic blasts. Bang, clack, bang, clack, bang, clack. Too fast, Wilhelm realized. Far too fast. The echo rolled across the ridge like continuous thunder. Sand exploded in front of them. Rocks chipped apart. The stone wall shuddered under the impact of repeated hits. Bauer swore again and swung his MG-34 onto the American line. The machine gun roared, spitting a stream of tracers that stitched across the sand. Cover me! Wilhelm shouted over the deafening metallic clatter. The Americans didn't break easily. They scattered, dropping behind rocks and shallow dips in the terrain, firing up the ravine in disciplined volleys. They weren't panicked, not even surprised. They were coordinated. Another Garand shot slammed into the stone inches from Wilhelm's helmet, showering his face with fragments. He coughed and blinked but kept firing. Bolt fire, bolt fire, bolt fire. 5 rounds gone already. He ducked behind the wall and reached for a new stripper clip. His fingers trembled slightly, whether from adrenaline or fear he couldn't tell. Reloading! He hissed. Bauer's voice came strained, panicked. They're pushing left! Wilhelm jammed the clip into the rifle's internal magazine, thumbed the bolt forward, and rose again. The Americans were indeed pushing left, maneuvering smartly, using the terrain better than expected. They were adapting quickly, using their superior rifles to suppress German positions while a second squad crept around the flank. Wilhelm felt his stomach clench. Where were the panzers? Where was the support? Where a shell screamed overhead and exploded far behind them, American artillery. His chest tightened. They came prepared, and they came fast. Another Garand volley peppered the wall, sharper and closer. Wilhelm ducked again. His ears rang. His hands shook uncontrollably for a blowst moment. "They fire so fast," Bauer muttered. "They don't even stop to reload." Wilhelm looked at his rifle. 5 rounds, bolt action, simple, stubborn, outmatched. He'd never admit it to the others, but in this moment the truth pressed cold against his ribs. The Americans weren't the soft, inexperienced soldiers command had described. Their rifles alone tilted the fight. Wilhelm inhaled deeply, forcing calm back into his muscles. Fear wouldn't help. Only precision. Discipline. The fundamentals drilled into him from basic training to the freezing night exercises in the Ardennes. He rose again. An American rushed into view, young, freckles visible even from 20 meters out, rifle raised, eyes wide with determination. He fired once. Wilhelm flinched as the bullet punched the stone near his elbow. He aimed and shot back, dropping the man instantly. Bolt, chamber, fire. But more Americans followed. More than he and Bauer could hold back. Bauer shouted, "They're regrouping! They're coming in strength! Schmidt, fall back!" Wilhelm hesitated. Retreat wasn't part of the plan. They were ordered to hold until armoured support arrived. But armoured support wasn't here. The Americans were, and their rifles kept hammering. The Garand clips pinged loudly as they ejected, echoing through the ravine. New clips snapped in with metallic authority. The Americans barely slowed. Wilhelm's breath caught. "Fall back," Bauer repeated, voice cracking. "We can't hold this with bolt actions." It felt like betrayal abandoning their position, giving ground to an enemy they didn't yet fully understand. But death was no use to any of them. Wilhelm swallowed hard. "Go!" he shouted. "Move!" Bauer kept the MG-34 firing in controlled bursts as they crawled backward along the trench, dust kicking around them like tiny explosions. Garand shots followed them every step of the way. They made it to the secondary ridge, lungs burning, knees scraped raw, sweat pouring down their backs beneath heavy gear. Weiss appeared out of the dust cloud, expression twisted in fury and disbelief. "What happened? Why are you retreating? That line must be held." Bauer nearly collapsed. "Herr Leutnant, they have semi-autos, dozens of them. They fire too fast, we couldn't cycle the bolts fast enough." Weiss froze. Slowly, Wilhelm lifted his rifle, showing the bolt, showing the limits they had known for years. "Sir," he rasped, "their rifles fire 8 rounds almost as fast as we can fire 2. Weiss's face drained of colour. 8? He whispered. Wilhelm nodded slowly. "Yes, Herr Leutnant." Silence. Then, distant across the desert, the Americans fired again, volley after rapid volley echoing like rolling thunder. Weiss closed his eyes. God help us. The German secondary line stretched like a jagged scar across the ridge, reinforced only by a few sandbags, rusted metal stakes, and whatever scrap the men could, pile into firing positions. It was not designed to withstand a determined assault, certainly not one backed by American artillery and rapid-firing Garand rifles. But for now, it was the only barrier between the advancing Americans and the supply route feeding the German defense around Sidi Bouzid. Obergrenadier Wilhelm Schmidt crouched behind a crate of loose 7.92mm rounds, chest heaving, sweat dripping from his brow despite the morning chill. He wiped his palms against his tunic, though it did little good. The dust had mixed with sweat to form a gritty paste that clung stubbornly to his skin. The other men looked no better. Bauer sat slumped beside him, his MG-34 resting across his thighs like a sleeping animal. His breath came in short, sharp bursts, as though he were trying unsuccessfully to calm a racing heart. Wilhelm forced himself to inhale deeply. The air tasted of sand, oil, and panic. Lieutenant Weiss stood a few meters away, speaking quickly into his field radio. His crisp uniform was now smeared with dust, and his hair hung loosely across his forehead. The man who once radiated polished confidence now looked strained, tense like a cable pulled too tight. "Yes, I understand. Send them as soon as possible," Weiss said into the handset, jaw clenched. "And tell Oberstleutnant Kruger the Americans are not lightly equipped. They carry semi-automatic rifles. Repeat, semi-automatic rifles." He paused, listening. No, this is not exaggeration. My men have seen it firsthand. Another pause. Yes, I will hold the ridge. But we need the panzers. He clicked the handset off and exhaled slowly. For a moment he didn't seem to notice the dozen eyes watching him. When he finally turned toward the men, there was none of the usual stern authority he projected during morning briefings. Only fatigue. They're sending 2 Panzer III platoons, he said. Estimated arrival within the hour. Bauer groaned. An hour? They'll be at our throats in minutes. Weiss's gaze hardened. We hold until then. If the Americans take this ridge, the supply route behind us is cut, then the entire sector collapses. Wilhelm swallowed. On any map the position looked insignificant, a nameless ridge among dozens, but sometimes the smallest lines broke the biggest fronts. Weiss stepped closer. Schmidt, Wilhelm snapped to attention. Herr Leutnant. You're my best shot. Bauer's machine gun covers the center sector. You take the right flank. We cannot let them circle around us as they did earlier. Jaw clenched. Wilhelm nodded. Understood. He didn't feel like the best shot. Not anymore. Not when the enemy could fire 8 rounds in the time it took him to send off 2. But he was what they had. Bauer rose shakily to his feet, slinging a new belt of ammunition onto the MG-34. If those American rifles fire that fast, why do they need a machine gun? He muttered bitterly. They have those too, Wilhelm said. He'd glimpsed a Browning M1919 among the advancing troops, another reminder that America approached war like an industrial problem to be solved by overwhelming output. Bauer cursed under his breath. Weiss lifted his binoculars and looked toward the horizon. Positions. Now. The approach. The desert in front of them simmered under the strengthening sun. Heat waves shimmered above the sand, turning distant figures into ghost-like shapes. But there was no mistaking the movement along the ridge below. American infantry. Not just a probing squad this time, a full company. 3 platoons advancing cautiously in staggered formations, rifles at the ready. Some moved through sparse patches of brush, others along natural folds in the terrain. They were coordinated, communicating with hand signals, watching each other's angles. Disciplined. Wilhelm felt the uneasy twist in his gut again. Rumors had painted Americans as untested and unprepared. These men were neither. Their strides were confident, their spacing precise. They moved with a professionalism that came only from training, and training required resources. Resources the Americans seemed to have in abundance. Weiss lowered the binoculars. They'll be in firing range soon, he murmured. Hold your fire until they commit. Wilhelm checked his sights, then tucked himself behind a broken sandstone slab overlooking the right side. From here he could see the shallow depression leading to a scrub-covered ravine, the same path the Americans had used earlier to flank them. Not again. He wouldn't allow it. Not on his side. He rested the rifle against the stone, cheek pressed against the worn stock. The bolt gleamed faintly in the sunlight. 5 rounds. No more. No less. The first American cresting the ridge carried a garand held tightly against his shoulder. He scanned the ground ahead with deliberate caution. When his gaze swept near Wilhelm's position, Wilhelm swallowed. His throat felt tight and dry. Patience. Timing wins battles, not nerves. The American squad halted, conferring silently. Then they advanced again. Weiss raised his arm. Wait. The Americans drew closer. Wait. A second squad moved alongside them, flanking carefully. Wait. Another 10 meters. Now. Weiss's hand dropped sharply. Bauer's MG-34 unleashed a tearing roar that shattered the desert silence. The gun rattled violently against the sandbags, showering brass casings in every direction. American troops dove for cover instantly, returning fire in rapid semi-automatic bursts. Wilhelm exhaled and fired. The recoil nudged his shoulder. He worked the bolt with practiced speed and fired again. Bolt. Fire. Bolt. Fire. 2 Americans fell. A third dropped behind a rock. But then the Garand spoke again. 8-round barrages poured across the ridge, rattling the stones, kicking up dust, peppering the air with fragments. Wilhelm ducked just in time as several rounds cracked overhead. "Reloading!" Bauer yelled, yanking a new belt across the MG-34's feed tray. Wilhelm had already emptied his second clip of the fight. He reloaded quickly, fingertips burning from the heat of the chamber. The Americans pushed harder this time, advancing in small rushes, firing from behind scattered rocks and low rises. Some of them moved with a fluidity that made Wilhelm's chest tighten. They weren't just brave, they were well trained. Another Garand volley hammered the ridge, forcing Wilhelm to duck completely behind the sandstone slab. Dust showered him as a bullet drilled through the rock and ricocheted past his ear with a violent whine. He flinched, heart leaping into his throat. They were getting too close. Bauer cursed loudly. "They're pushing my sector! Schmidt, help!" Wilhelm slid across the trench, lifted his rifle, and lined up a shot. 3 Americans sprinted toward a cluster of rocks near Bauer's gun position, trying to get close enough to lob grenades. Wilhelm fired, one fell. Bolt. He fired again, the second crumpled. Bolt. He lined up on the third, but the man reached cover before Wilhelm could cycle a third round. Wilhelm swore under his breath. Why couldn't he fire faster? Why did every shot require the same mechanical dance? Lift, pull, push, settle, aim, fire. Why did his weapon feel like something from another era compared to the Americans' sleek, brutal rhythm? He forced the frustration down. Anger helped no one. Another Garand burst sent him ducking again. The Americans were closing within grenade range. "Bauer!" Wilhelm shouted. "Short bursts cover the left." "I'm trying." The MG-34's barrel glowed a faint red as Bauer fired controlled bursts, sweeping the field with suppressing lines of fire. The machine gun roared, but for every enemy pinned, another shifted to a better position. Wilhelm peered over the rock again, wiping dust from his lashes. Then he saw it. Among the advancing Americans was a soldier kneeling behind a Browning automatic rifle, the BAR. "Oh, no," he whispered. The American lifted the BAR, steadied it, and unleashed a devastating stream of automatic fire. Bullets ripped across the ridge, shredding sandbags, kicking up violent sprays of sand, hammering into the rocky outcroppings. Wilhelm ducked instinctively, arms thrown over his head as fragments of shattered stone rained down on him. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Bauer screamed and rolled aside as the BAR rounds chewed through the MG-34's position. "We can't hold this!" Bauer shouted over the barrage. "They have too much firepower!" Wilhelm lifted his head again, and that was when he saw them. Moving through the ravine on the right flank, 5 Americans crawling low, using the scrub for cover. They were almost invisible, except for the faint shine of metal when the sun struck. Their rifles. They were going to flank the ridge. Again, Wilhelm's pulse spiked. "Right flank," he yelled. "They're circling." A bullet struck the stone near his face with such force it felt like the rock itself exploded. He reeled backward, coughing, spitting dust. He wiped his eyes and froze. The American squad was now sprinting the final meters toward the ridge. Too close. Far too close. Wilhelm dropped instantly into firing position. He fired one down. Bolt. He fired again. Another fell. Bolt. He aimed at the third. But the man dove behind a boulder before Wilhelm could complete the bolt cycle. "Bauer!" Wilhelm shouted. "They're almost on top of us!" Bauer swung the MG-34 and unleashed a fierce burst. The gun spat death, tearing through the brush, scattering the flanking squad's advance. But the MG-34 fell silent with a sharp metallic clunk. Bauer froze. "No! No! Not now!" He yanked the charging handle desperately. "It's jammed!" Wilhelm swore under his breath, grabbed Bauer's shoulder, and pulled him down just as another BAR burst swept the ridge. The machine gunner looked at him with wide, terrified eyes. "We have to fall back." Wilhelm shook his head, breath shaking. "We can't. Not again. If we do..." A distant rumble interrupted him. Low, heavy, mechanical. Bauer's eyes widened. "Is that..." Wilhelm lifted his head cautiously. Along the rear slope, glinting in the sun, rolling forward with slow, menacing confidence. Panzer III tanks. At least 6 of them. Weiss stood tall the moment he heard them, relief flooding his features. "Hold the line!" he shouted with renewed strength. "Armor is here!" The roar of the tanks grew louder as they crested the ridge behind the Germans. Their turrets rotated with mechanical precision toward the advancing Americans. The Americans hesitated, for the first time all morning, and that hesitation cost them. The lead panzer fired. The shell screamed across the desert and detonated in the center of an American squad. Sand erupted in a violent plume. Bodies were flung aside like rag dolls. Another panzer fired, striking the ground near the BAR gunner. The explosion sent the man cartwheeling backward, his weapon flying from his hands. The Americans broke formation. Some fell back, others scrambled into the ravine. A few remained pinned, firing desperately to cover their retreat. Wilhelm exhaled for what felt like the first time in minutes. His body sagged against the stone, muscles trembling with exhaustion. They had survived. Barely. But the fight was not over. The Americans were regrouping below, forming new defensive lines as the panzers advanced. Weiss turned to the men, face fierce with determination. "This is our moment," he said. "We counterattack. Push them back before they reorganize. Schmidt-Bauer, you're on me." Wilhelm nodded. Bauer swallowed and hefted the MG-34 again. The desert wind rose slightly, carrying distant echoes of Garand fire that was fading now less certain, less relentless. Wilhelm felt the weight of his rifle again. 5 rounds, against whatever came next. He rose anyway, because battles weren't won by having the best weapon. They were won by the men who refused to break. The sun rose higher, turning the desert into an anvil of heat and glare. The Panzer III platoons rolled forward with the clanking authority of steel beasts awakened from restless sleep. Their engines growled, treads grinding over loose stones, as if the earth itself were protesting their advance. The dust clouds they kicked up rose like ghosts behind them, staining the morning sky. Obergrenadier Wilhelm Schmidt ran alongside Lieutenant Weiss and Bauer as the German infantry repositioned to follow behind the panzers. The adrenaline coursing through Wilhelm's veins felt hot and heavy, like molten iron. His hands trembled from the shock of battle, but his feet moved automatically, driven by the momentum of survival. The Americans had begun withdrawing toward a secondary ridgeline across the valley, orderly at first, but now increasingly chaotic as the Panzer's 50mm cannons boomed again and again, sending geysers of sand and shrapnel into the air. Bauer jogged beside Wilhelm, MG-34 slung across his chest, belt of ammunition bouncing heavily at his hip. His face was pale beneath the dust. "Schmidt," he gasped. "Did you see that last shot? Blew them 20 meters into the air." Wilhelm shook his head. "Don't think about it." "How am I supposed not to think about it?" "Focus on your footing," Wilhelm replied, avoiding a jagged rock. "Focus on the next step. And the next. Everything else comes later." Bauer forced a bitter laugh. "If there is a later." Weiss turned sharply. Silence, eyes front. His tone was hard, but Wilhelm didn't miss the tremor of fatigue underneath. The lieutenant was exhausted too, pushing himself to maintain discipline, to keep fear from spreading. They reached a natural dip in the ground and dropped into formation behind a panzer. Weiss raised his binoculars. The Americans weren't fleeing blindly. They weren't routing. They were regrouping, falling back to a defensible ridge, using every scrap of cover the terrain offered. And they fired. Even as they retreated, they fired. The M1 Garands barked with relentless precision. Bang, clack, bang, clack, bang, clack. The cadence rolled across the desert like the beating heart of a machine. Wilhelm winced every time he heard it. He envied the Americans, their rifles, not the firepower, but the fluidity, the lack of interruption, the absence of that mechanical pause, that vulnerable heartbeat where a bolt-action rifle demanded attention. Ahead, the panzers slowed. Their commanders signaled for the infantry to spread out. The Germans fanned across the valley floor, rifles raised. A shell from an American 75mm gun crashed into the sand 20 meters to Wilhelm's right. The explosion rippled the earth with a deep, chest-thundering vibration. Wilhelm flung himself down as sand spattered over him. "Artillery!" Bauer screamed, scrambling behind a low ridge of stone. Weiss pointed toward a cluster of smoke rising behind the American lines. "Their guns are dug in on the next ridge. They'll try to pin the tanks." Another shell whistled overhead and smashed directly into a panzer farther left. The blast blew open the turret like a tin can. Flames burst from the hatch. A German crewman climbed halfway out, screaming, before collapsing back into the inferno. Bauer's face twisted with horror. "God help them!" "We keep moving," Weiss ordered. "Stay low and advance behind the armor." Wilhelm swallowed his fear and rose again, sprinting behind the nearest panzer as its turret rotated to find the American artillery. Sweat stung his eyes. His boots slipped on loose rock. Every breath burned as if he were inhaling fire. The panzers fired again. Their shells slammed into the American ridge, sending debris flying. But the American artillery answered almost instantly, well-trained, well-timed. Wilhelm couldn't help noticing. The Americans recovered faster. Their cycle was quicker. Their coordination immediate. Another Garand volley tore across the valley, forcing Wilhelm to dive behind the panzer. Bullets pinged off the armor with harsh metallic whines. Weiss flattened himself beside Wilhelm. "They're targeting the infantry. Keep your heads down." Wilhelm leaned his cheek against the warm steel of the tank. It vibrated from the engine's rhythmic growl. He steadied his breath and peered out from behind the treads. The Americans were now fully entrenched on the ridge, over 100 men, all armed with Garands or BARs. Their positions were spaced evenly, well camouflaged. They fired with aggressive control, not desperation, and among them, Wilhelm spotted a distinct figure, a sergeant firing methodically, barking orders, guiding his men with clear hand signals. "See that one?" Wilhelm said, nudging Bauer. "The one calling their shots." Bauer followed his line of sight. "The red bandana guy? Take him out," Wilhelm said. "He's directing their defense." Bauer set the MG-34 on its bipod, aligned the sights, and held his breath. Wilhelm covered him. The MG-34 thundered. A streak of bullets tore through the rocks. The American sergeant dove aside. Dust plumed. When the air cleared, Wilhelm spotted him again, wounded, limping, but still shouting commands. "Again!" Wilhelm urged. Bauer fired another burst. The American sergeant collapsed. Wilhelm allowed himself one breath of relief. "One." Then the Americans answered. A focused wave of Garand fire swept toward their position. The panzer's steel clanged sharply. Chips of rock flew like shrapnel. Wilhelm ducked so fast his helmet nearly flew off. Bauer scrambled to cover, clutching the MG-34. "Too many of them," Weiss motioned sharply. "Shift right, use that ridge." They sprinted toward a low rise, offering some cover. Wilhelm slid into place behind a rock barely wide enough to shield him. Bauer flopped beside him, panting. Wilhelm raised his rifle, scanning for targets. He spotted two Americans repositioning a BAR gunner and his assistant. The BAR lifted, strafing the valley with suppressive fire. Wilhelm lined up the shot. "Steady, breathe." He fired. The BAR gunner fell backward, rifle slipping from his hands. The assistant grabbed for the weapon. Wilhelm chambered another round and fired again. The assistant dropped. Bauer stared. "You got both." "Keep your head down," Wilhelm replied. "More coming." Indeed, the Americans were adjusting their lines, shifting their focus from the panzers to the German infantry. They were treating the panzers as a manageable threat, but it was the infantry they needed to suppress to prevent a close assault. Weiss peered through his binoculars. "They're stalling us, holding us here for something. Look for flanking maneuvers." Wilhelm scanned the far left. Then he saw it. American infantry moving through a dry riverbed, a squad-sized element advancing rapidly to flank the German armor. "Weiss!" Wilhelm shouted. "Left flank riverbed!" Weiss swung the binoculars. His face tightened. "Good eyes," Bauer, redirect fire! The MG-34 barked again, sending hot casings spilling across the sand. Wilhelm fired alongside him, forcing the American flankers to scatter. But even pinned, the Americans fought with relentless determination. "Where are our support elements?" Bauer gasped between bursts. "Where's the rest of the battalion?" Weiss didn't answer. The truth hung bitter in the air. They were alone for now, stretched thin, fighting an enemy they had underestimated. Another artillery shell screamed overhead and crashed behind the German line, shaking the earth with a deep, heavy thud. Sand rained down in gritty showers. Weiss lowered his binoculars. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the truth. "They're not falling back." Wilhelm swallowed. "They're not?" "No," Weiss said grimly. "They're buying time." "For what?" Bauer demanded. As if in answer, a deep mechanical rumble echoed across the valley. But it wasn't German. It came from the American position. Wilhelm twisted toward the ridge and froze. A column of American armor appeared through the dust. Not Sherman's, those would come later. These were M3 Lee tanks, ungainly, tall, multi-turreted beasts with a sponson-mounted 75mm cannon and a second gun in the turret. Clumsy-looking, ugly, but deadly, especially to Panzer IEs. Weiss's expression hardened. "Tanks. They brought tanks." Bauer's voice cracked. "We're dead." "No," Wilhelm said, though his own heart hammered. "We're not dead. But we need the panzers to pull back. They can't fight those at this angle." The American Lees lined up, their 75mm sponson guns rotated forward. Wilhelm knew what came next. "Cover!" he screamed. The American armor fired. The valley exploded. A Panzer III took a direct hit, its turret blown skyward in a plume of smoke and debris. Another tank reversed desperately, treads grinding as it tried to escape the lethal angle of American fire. Wilhelm shielded his face as a shockwave rippled through him. Sand and metal fragments rained across the ridge. When he looked again, 2 German tanks were burning. The others were trying to reposition. "Fall back!" Weiss bellowed. "All units fall back to the secondary ridge." Wilhelm grabbed Bauer, pulling him upright. "Move! Now!" Bauer stumbled. "Schmidt, my leg!" Wilhelm threw his arm around Bauer's shoulders. "Lean on me. We're getting out." Bullets from Garans chased them as they ran. Dust plumes erupted around their feet. The roar of the American Lees grew louder, engines revving as they pressed their advantage. The desert was chaos, smoke, fire, screams, shattering armor, barking rifles, the howl of tank cannons. Wilhelm's lungs burned as he half-dragged Bauer up the incline toward the fallback ridge. Weiss fired his pistol behind them, shouting for the men to keep moving. The Panzer III nearest the riverbed exploded in a burst of flame, flipping onto its side. Wilhelm didn't look back again. He just ran. They reached the fallback ridge just as the surviving panzers began withdrawing behind them. Wilhelm collapsed behind a boulder, gasping. Bauer slumped beside him, clutching his leg. Weiss arrived seconds later, sliding into cover. His face was streaked with dust and sweat. He scanned the valley below. The Americans were advancing again, slow, methodical, relentless. Their rifles echoed with unnerving confidence. Their tanks rolled with industrial inevitability. Wilhelm gripped his rifle tightly. The fight was far from over, but one truth had become painfully clear. The Americans were not the inexperienced enemy they had been promised. They were something far more dangerous. They were learning, quickly. And the desert was becoming a proving ground for a new kind of warfare, one the Germans were only beginning to understand. Wilhelm steadied his breath. Whatever came next, he would face it. Bolt-action rifle against semi-auto might, old world against new. And the desert swallowed the echoes of battle as both armies prepared for the next storm. The desert wind shifted, carrying with it the distant echo of engines, American engines moving steadily across the valley floor. Wilhelm pressed his back against the rock, wiping grit from his lips. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, loud enough to mask the sounds of distant rifle fire. Bauer leaned beside him, wincing as he applied pressure to his wounded leg. "You're bleeding too much," Wilhelm muttered, tearing a strip of cloth from his undershirt. Bauer groaned. Bleeding too much. Wilhelm wrapped the makeshift bandage tight around Bauer's thigh. Blood seeped through almost instantly, but the pressure slowed it. Bauer's face twisted, teeth clenched, but he managed a strained laugh. At least now I have an excuse not to run anymore. Wilhelm signed heavily. Stay down. Conserve your strength. Weiss slid into cover in front of them, boots kicking up dust. He knelt, eyes scanning the valley with a hardened, assessing gaze. The Americans are reorganizing. Their tanks aren't rushing, they're holding position. They know we're hurt. They're preparing another push. Wilhelm's throat tightened. How long until we get reinforcements? Weiss didn't look at him. He didn't need to. Silence was answer enough. Our orders were to hold, the lieutenant said quietly. So we hold. Bauer scoffed, breath shaky. Hold with what? Half the company's down. 2 panzers left. We're outnumbered and outgunned. Weiss's jaw tightened. And yet we're still alive. Another volley of American fire crackled across the valley. Wilhelm ducked instinctively. The rounds were far-probing shots, rather than a focused barrage. But they were confident shots, the kind fired by men who knew they had the advantage. Wilhelm adjusted the strap on his helmet. They'll come soon. Weiss nodded grimly. Yes. And when they do, we'll make them bleed for every meter. Wilhelm glanced at his rifle. 50-year-old engineering updated for wartime efficiency. Beautiful craftsmanship. Precise, but old, unforgiving, demanding. 5 rounds. He lifted his gaze toward the American lines. Their rifles glinted under the sun, sleek, semi-automatic, fast. Their tanks stood firm, unmoving shadows of steel. A chill crawled down Wilhelm's spine. How are we supposed to stop them? He whispered before he could stop himself. Weiss heard him, and for once the lieutenant didn't scold him for doubt. He simply placed a hand on Wilhelm's shoulder, a rare gesture of humanity. With discipline, Weiss said softly. With training. With what we know. Their rifles fire fast. Their tanks hit hard. But they bleed. They break. They feel fear. The desert punishes everyone, Schmidt Americans included. They don't know its teeth yet. Wilhelm swallowed. The words helped, if only a little. Bauer shifted weakly. Then let's hope the desert bites them soon. Weiss managed a faint ghost of a smile. Then it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He looked to his right. Positions, he shouted suddenly. They're moving. Wilhelm snapped upright. Across the valley, like a mirage gaining shape, American infantry began spreading out again, 2 platoons advancing cautiously, rifles up, supported by the looming silhouettes of the M3 Lees. The tanks rolled deliberately, treads grinding over the rough ground, guns angled forward like the eyes of predators. The Garands cracked, again testing the ridge, searching for German muzzle flashes. Wilhelm steadied his breath. Schmidt, Weiss said, voice low and firm. You anchor the center. Pick off their NCOs. Slow their advance. Bauer, conserve your fire and wait for my signal. Bauer nodded weakly, gripping the MG-34. Wilhelm checked his sights. A familiar calm washed over him, the calm that came in the space between fear and action, the space where instinct took over. He lined up his first target, an American squad leader signaling to his men as they fanned across the valley floor. Weiss whispered, Hold. The Americans moved closer. Hold. The tanks adjusted their angle. Hold. Wilhelm exhaled. Now. Wilhelm fired, sending the bolt slamming backward as the American squad leader dropped. Bauer's MG-34 erupted in a furious burst, cutting swaths through the sand and forcing the Americans to dive for cover. Garand fire answered instantly, faster, louder, more confident. The ridge exploded into noise. The battle resumed, and Wilhelm knew with grim clarity, this fight wasn't about territory. It was about time. Who could last longer? Who would break first? The desert watched silently as the armies clashed again, old steel against new fire, discipline against innovation, endurance against momentum. By day's end, the sand would drink more blood. Whose? Wilhelm did not yet know. But he raised his rifle, set his jaw, and prepared to find out. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.